This conference will now be recorded.
Yay, it's going to work this week. We had trouble with it last week. And I think it may have been due to I had an update waiting out there to be applied to my computer. And actually, interestingly enough, when I applied an update on Monday, it almost crashed my computer. And it took me several tries to make sure that it got through. There was some kind of a TPM error I kept getting, and I couldn't figure out what to do about that. But I just kept trying the update, and eventually it worked. So I'm not sure what was going on there. I'm just hoping it's not something wrong with my hard drive on this PC. But I went ahead and backed everything up, all my files, so just in case. And I have a backup smaller computer. It's a Surface, just in case. And I've got all the files on a a thumb drive, as well as I'm transferring those to the other PC. Anyway, that's my deal. All right, let's get into this. We shall not, or we will not, be silenced by Lutzer. Hopefully, you're finding this book very helpful, and and I think you will as we progress through the 10 chapters. And we're moving into chapter 2 this evening. And so, with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen and get that done. And then I'll bring up this PowerPoint that I sent. Yes, I sent this to you guys with the questions on there that we can use for discussion purposes tonight, okay? So on pages 41 through 48, I asked the question, what's the one word that Lutzer used only once? He only used this word once, but the concept is all over the place in pages 41 through 48. Did anybody find that one word that he used only once that really describes what's going on and really takes the concepts that he references so frequently in those pages and really throughout the book and encapsulates it into one word? Did anybody find that word?
You've, you think at a higher plane than most of us. So I'm not sure if this is the right word or not, but the one that I came up with was revolution.
Revolution. That's not the word I had in mind, but you're not far off, and it's very, very. That is a good thematic word that you find that is truly a theme throughout the book, isn't it? So I'm not going to say it's wrong. I'm just going to say it's a different word than I had in mind, but it's certainly a concept that's prevalent. So good, good, excellent. Anybody else?
Steve, is it a race?
Erase, okay. That's another word that you find throughout in terms of expressing the concept that you see throughout the book. Absolutely, not the word I had in mind, but definitely true. Anybody else? Well, let me give you my thoughts on this. I think those are two good words. I think those two words actually fall under the word that is on page 44. And on page 44, Lutzer makes this statement. If you have the hard copy of the book and you want to turn there, that's great. Or if you have a Kindle version, if you have a Kindle version and you're following along, if you look at the section called The Destruction of Monuments in chapter 2, and you go about 2 pages over, or maybe something like that, and there's a quote by an Angela Rye. Right above that quote, he uses this word deconstructing, and really deconstruction is the term. So he says, in keeping with the secularist commitment to deconstructing American history, political commentator Angela Rye said this: "We have to get to the heart of the problem here. The heart is the way many of us were taught American history. American history is not all glorious. George Washington was a slave owner. We need to call slave owners out for what they are. Whether we think they were protecting American freedom or not, he wasn't protecting my freedoms. I wasn't someone. My ancestors weren't deemed human beings. To me, I don't care if it's a George Washington statue or Thomas Jefferson, they all need to come down." So, deconstruction is a term that is really, it traces its way back to a philosopher by the name of Jacques Derrida, and it's been embraced within it's even been embraced within Christianity. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to show you something. I went out here and just before class, I thought, well, I'm going to take a look at this. Let me see if I can get over here. And I just did a quick Google search of Christian deconstructionism. And well, not a Google search, it's a search. By the way, if you're not using DuckDuckGo, you might want to use DuckDuckGo. It encrypts your searches so that they can't trace all the stuff that you're doing out there. But get DuckDuckGo and make that your search engine. So anyway, I searched for Christian deconstructionism and I got all these hits. And let me just share with you a couple of things related to Christian deconstructionism. And what we're specifically talking about here is we're taking the concept of the philosophy really of deconstructionism. And I tried to read a book that was written by Jack Derrida on deconstructionism when I took a course a couple of years ago in kind of a survey of philosophies as I was getting into this program that I'm in. And honestly, with these philosophers, you get so far, you get to a certain point with them and your head just starts spinning. It's like, guys, you're just going around and around in circles and you're not arriving at any conclusions. You're just trying to impress people with how intelligent you are in the way that you think through things, and you can come up with terms and you can describe concepts, ad infinitum without end, and where's the practical value in what you're trying to do? That's kind of what I walked away from it with. And it's sort of like studying, alternate religions. If you start studying the Quran and Islam and other religions, it's very dark and it's very depressing to me to look at that stuff. It's kind of the same way with philosophy. I'm like, I don't know how anybody can really be a philosopher, because to me, philosophy apart from God is nothing but, and I wrote a paper at the end of the class. I had to write a paper, and I basically said it's anthropocentric academic speculation. It's just a bunch of man-centered academic speculation. That's really what it is. And that raised some eyebrows when I presented that paper at the end of the class. But the professor was kind of impressed. He was like, "Oh, that's pretty. I like that term, So anyway, Christian deconstructionism is where within the realm of Christianity, you have those who have embraced this idea of deconstructionism. So what is deconstructionism? Because you're going to hear this term probably occasionally referenced in different books that you read or news articles or discussions that you hear about what's going on in our culture today, because it's a part of the whole discussion. So I clicked on this article, The 6 Pillars of Religious Deconstruction by Keith Giles. And let me just share this with you real quickly. You might want to go out and read this or do a similar search if you're interested in this. But notice what he says. He says the first pillar of Christian deconstruction is the Bible. And basically what is happening with Christian deconstructionism is they're questioning the authenticity of the Bible. And he said, he goes on to say, it's not hard to prove that the Bible is indeed filled with errors, mistakes, contradictions between prophets, discrepancies over details, and even misquoted Bible verses. And he makes that statement, but he doesn't actually support that statement. He says, so if your pastor has ever told you that the Bible was 100% accurate about everything, and if even one thing was proven false, then the entire Bible would be worthless. Then it only takes one of those examples above to start pulling on the thread that eventually unravels your entire Christian faith. The second pillar is eternal torment. So once you start to doubt the absolute accuracy of scriptures, there's a short walk to questioning the validity of hell. And then, now you're getting into universalism. Then, if you follow it further, the third pillar of deconstructionism is penal substitutionary atonement. And simply put, the PSA theory says that God's wrath was so great against mankind's sinfulness that Jesus had to come and take a bullet for us so that now God can love us and forgive us. In this view, Jesus mostly saves us from his Father, not from our sins or from hell. This also paints God as a monster who responds to his children with anger and fierce violence rather than with love and compassion. So they start attacking the whole concept of substitutionary, what's typically been called substitutionary atonement, should be called more like the full payment, the expiation of sins through Jesus's death on the cross. So basically what happens in constructionism is, as this particular writer describes it, he says deconstructionism is it a valid way to interpret the Bible? And so he defines it here. And deconstructionism is basically a theory of textual criticism or interpretation that denies that there is any single correct meaning or interpretation of a passage or text. So where does that really take us? It takes us back to relativism. It takes us back to subjectivism and a subjective relativism where your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth and everybody has their truth, because there is no standard of truth. That's essentially what deconstructionism does. So it's an approach to critically examining any subject, so that you go in and you basically deconstruct that subject to the point that, and by deconstructing it, I mean critiquing it to the point where you destroy, or you attempt to destroy, any basis for faith in that subject. And once you do that, okay, that's the end of the game, because the philosophy of deconstructionism, Derrida, never took it further and developed a comprehensive what's on the backside of that. After you do all your deconstruction, what's on the backside of that in terms of your philosophy for life? And he never got that far. He was just a critic, basically. And that's has been brought over into the Christian church and used really by Satan to inject into the Christianity a false hermeneutic, a false approach to interpreting the Bible, where everything is criticized, but there's nothing left at the end of the day. So deconstructionism is a very pernicious and, quite frankly, evil philosophy. So in this book, what stands out, if you look through the pages here, I'll just give you a few examples on those pages of that I mentioned, 41 through 46 or so, 41 through 48. Here's a few examples of where, he sort of illustrating what happens when deconstructionism is followed. On page 42, he's talking about, let me start on page 41. He says, on page 41, the last paragraph, he says, revising history lies at the heart of all social and political revolutions. And there, I think it was Fran that mentioned revolution, or maybe it was Caleb, I don't know which. But anyway, one of you mentioned revolution. Perhaps the best example is the bloody cultural revolution in China, 1966-76. Mao Zedong decreed that China was to rid itself of all traces of capitalistic Western influence. That's deconstructionism. That's taking something, basically destroying the basis for what's going on in their current culture and society. The Red Guards took to the streets and monuments were destroyed. Does that sound anything like what happened last summer? Western literature was burned, and all vestiges of memory of what was the foundational pillars for the society began to get destroyed. Deconstruction. Western literature was burned and buildings renamed, along with new designations given for cities and streets to reflect contemporary heroes. Churches were either destroyed or repurposed. Either you sided with the new Marxist standard of justice and equality, or you did not. Those who didn't get on board were jailed or killed. Thankfully, we are not there yet in America. Well, this book was copyrighted in the fall of 2020. I would say in the period between just the fall of 2020 and now, where you've seen a tremendous moves in that direction even further. As a matter of fact, in Canada, I don't know if you've seen it, but the pastors that are getting jailed for just preaching the gospel, and that pastor from Poland that basically ran, the police out of his church, who showed up on Easter Sunday to disrupt his services, and he ran them off. He ended up, guess what? They circled back. They circled back just this past weekend and arrested him. So they're getting arrested and jailed for things that are just nothing more than free speech. Well, thankfully, we are not there yet in America, he says, but the point to be made is that when revolutionaries want to remake a country, they vilify the past to give legitimacy to their vision of the future. It is obvious that the ministry of truth, quote unquote, is busily at work transforming America by rewriting the past. They say their purpose is to root out racism. There's the Marxist agenda as well, where you create the oppressed oppressor narrative. But a look at what they're doing reveals a much more sinister goal. They are using racism to attack America at its core. It is not about making America better. It's about destroying the past, deconstructionism, to build America on an entirely different foundation, which they have not defined, unless it's just moving toward a Marxist utopia, which is a dystopia, quite frankly. Other examples, if you flip over to page 43, he says, is America's past history of slavery reason to discard its Judeo-Christian values? There's the deconstructionism, discarding the pillars of our society, which is its Judeo-Christian values. Even within Christianity, I hear professors, I hear theologians, I hear pastors downplaying Judeo-Christianity, the Judeo-Christian values that form the basis and the glue that held our society together and gave it common values and common purpose. So then moving on, he says also, the destruction of monuments is a part of a larger attempt to destroy what it means to be an American. It's an attempt to remove not just racism, but to discredit all else that was done by those who created our nation's founding documents and established the foundational principles that led to making America what it is. So those are, let me see, there's one other I wanted to share with you over here on page 44. Once the words racist or white supremacist are attached to something, no matter how inaccurate, liberals will not risk their reputation by defending it. And then he says, in keeping with the secularists' commitment to deconstructing American history, and then he mentions this political commentator, Angela Rye, said this. So you're right. Whoever it was that said revolution, and whoever it was that said, what was the other one? Revolution, and one other word was offered as well. Both of them were correct. I think they fall under the umbrella of deconstructionism as a philosophy. So let's move on from there. The next question was, how did Howard Zinn, remember Howard Zinn? Remember his book that I've mentioned in the past? Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, which was nothing more than a revisionist history of the United States with a huge Marxist slant to it. That he I think it was published in 1980, and it became probably the most prominent history book, quote unquote. I'll put the word history in quotes because if you read Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Graybar, she tears his credentials apart and tears his research apart. His research was so shoddy when he pulled this book together. It was absolutely atrocious for anybody who's writing something of such at such a level that then becomes a standard within academia for our school children to be educated in the history of the United States. That it's just atrocious. So but Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States became sort of the de facto standard textbook for American history that was taught over decades in the United States. So how did Howard Zinn contribute to the indoctrination of decades of American students? If you look at page 48 and 49, I don't know if you saw that in there. He makes a brief mention of the book there. Did you get a chance to look at that, and anyone take a stab at that one?
Well, Steve, I think it's it's clear here that he's trying to debunk all of the successes of the United States, and completely rewrite history into making us an evil nation. But as the author points out here, is that he doesn't contrast that with all the evils of and brutality of communism, and the other failures of many other countries, and he doesn't talk about how the United States didn't invent slavery, but we ended slavery,
Hmm.
and there's still slavery. I think he said it's up to like 40 million people today that are still in slavery in other countries, and none of that's mentioned either.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, that's great. That's perfect, Caleb. That's exactly what he does. Now, and you're right. That's right there on. Now he doesn't go into Howard Zinn a lot. I mean, he's not writing a book on Howard Zinn, but he's mentioned here because he's so prominent in in the academic pipeline through which, when you think about it, okay, if a person's going through the academic pipeline, say high school in the 80s, where is that person today? That person's in their 40s or approaching 50. They're out there, and think about, okay, well, let's just say they're working in the government in some administrative administration. Well, there's where your deep state is located. And it's all of those people who are in the deep state who have been educated through the academic pipeline in the United States of America, the public academic pipeline, as well as private schools for that matter, that were educated in this type of view, this revisionist history of the United States. And the emphasis was not upon, okay, what were the aspirational values of our founding fathers? How were those embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? And, let's talk about civics, how we function, and let's move toward, and how we have moved toward a more perfect union as desired by our founding fathers, or that was part of their aspirational values. No, that's not what's emphasized. What's emphasized is the view of the United States from a lens of Howard Zinn and the Marxists, the globalist Marxists, and you're looking at the United States as basically here's all the things that happened that were wrong in the history of the United States. Well, my goodness, you can't find a nation in the history of the world where there hasn't been some wrongs in the course of its history, just because we're dealing with fallen man. So if you set aside, so what's here's what's happening. If you set aside the biblical, understanding, which was held by many of our founding fathers, that man is fallen, and there is a God and a God of perfect righteousness to which we must adjust our lives in some way, form, or fashion. If you set all that aside and you move toward an atheistic or a godless society that doesn't view and doesn't understand that there is a God toward which man must find adjustment in some way because God is righteous and he has these absolute standards, and you do away with absolute standards, and you say, God's not a part of this civic equation, and you do it, and you move in that direction, where do you end up? You end up in this world where you're totally confused by charges of, oh, well, look at this. Here's all this. Here's what happened that was evil in our history. Here's what happened that was wrong in our history. Here's what these guys did that were wrong in our history. And you're like, well, gee, that must mean the whole thing is bad, or the Judeo-Christian value system that was the foundation of our country must be discarded as well. You throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's exactly what's happening here. So what we see today is nothing, in terms of what the administration is doing, and what a lot of people in the political realm are doing today is they're pushing an ideology and a philosophy that's built, I guess, an ideology that's underpinned by a philosophy that, oh, if we just move toward this globalist Marxist kind of utopia that we don't know exactly what it looks like because it's never really existed, and it's been attempted in the past, but they just didn't get it quite right. So, but this time we'll get it right this time. And if we just print enough money, because these people who are promoting these ideologies, they've never worked a day in their life in the real world. They don't have any concept of what printing a bunch of money actually does. Right now, today, the biggest topic in all the business channels, if you are watching Fox Business today and watching some of the interviews that were happening today, it's all about inflation. And it's like, oh, everybody's all of a sudden caught by surprise. Well, you know, guess what? When you start printing, and I use the term printing loosely, that's not really how money is created this day and age. But when you start opening up the credit spigot and creating all kinds of and trillions of dollars, at some point the value of the dollar is going to be very, very low, and you've got a lot of dollars out there chasing not enough goods, and that creates inflation. Anybody with, I mean, you don't even have to have first semester economics to know that. And they don't get it. Either they don't get it or they don't care. And I think it's more of the latter, because the end justifies the means, even if it means bringing down the country. Because quite frankly, if you listen to someone like Chuck Schumer, that's exactly what he said. We're going to transform, we're going to take over, we're going to transform this country. This country is going to become something like, we want it to be, and like you've never seen before. He said that last fall. So, now why, I talk about all this stuff and it sounds like, well, Steve, you sound like, you sound like you're just talking about politics and a conservative position. And, what does this have to do with the spiritual life and the Bible and, our Christianity? Well, do you think there's a biblical view about economics? Do you think there's a biblical view about work? Do you think there's a biblical view about a biblically supported view about freedom and responsibility and the people's ability to the people's right and privilege to be able to work an honest day's work and save, and do you think freedom is more consistent with the decentralized type of government and economy versus a centralized government and economy? Well, all of those have there's biblical dimensions to every bit of that. There's a biblical view and biblical principles that we can extract from Scripture that we can use to evaluate economic, governmental systems to see whether they're consistent with freedom, God's desire for man to flourish, uh, the freedom of speech, all of those freedoms that are enumerated and specially called out, and rights that are specially called out in our Bill of Rights. And they were specially called out just to make sure that they didn't get overlooked. Not that the government was giving us rights, but God gave us rights, and the Constitution was simply recognizing those rights. Is that not consistent with biblical principles? Yeah, that's totally consistent with biblical principles. And when you set all that aside in the interest of centralized control by a godless elite that's interested in taking from those who have and giving to those who do not have, who are interested in using a lie of oppressed narrative to promote their ends, what does that sound like? That doesn't sound like anything biblical to me. So yes, all of this has relation to our Christianity and how we live out our faith in the marketplace, not only in the marketplace of ideas, but the marketplace itself. So for anyone who who's like, okay, where are we going with this? That's where we're going. Okay, let's move on here. What is the goal of the 1619 project? If you look at page 49 through 51, what's the goal of the 1619 project as you looked at those pages? Anybody take a look at that? I thought that was a good, nice summary of how it came about. That whole 1619 project started with the New York Times, a New York, as one guy calls them, the New York Slimes. The New York Times, so-called journalist, came up with this whole concept back in 1995, of all things. So it's been around for a while. What is the goal of the 1619 project?
Hey, Steve, I think it's very similar to the previous question. It's just they're trying to rewrite history to make it appear that our nation was founded on slavery vice liberty, and
Mm-hmm.
and to again, like create this atmosphere of revolution and all the things you hear about that are being taught in the schools about critical race theory, and how we're teaching our young kids that they should be ashamed, because they're of a Caucasian race,
Mm-hmm.
or that they, have the um, privilege of inheritance. And
Mm-hmm.
it's funny because I mean, I just remember, growing up in a 1,100 square foot, 3 bedroom, 1 bath house for the first 18 years of my life, and never really feeling that I was a privileged type of person,
Mm-hmm.
but my mom and dad love me very much, and they gave me the right guidance to get me started in my life, and that was a lot more valuable than any inheritance that they would have gave me. So it's not about monetary inheritance. It's about what we're passing on from generation to generation, as far as leadership and and living a Christian life.
Yeah, well said. Well said, Caleb. That's very true. I mean, I don't think, when I was picking up garbage, as my probably well outside of mowing yards, picking up garbage as part of my first job, I didn't feel very privileged, honestly. And there were white and black guys that did the same thing at the same time with me. So and that uh that whole idea of white privilege, I just laugh at it. It's unfortunate that that's a lens through which people view, certain people view the world and view other people, and it's just because of ignorance. They don't really know, you know. Um, so and they're also being deceived. They're being deceived by the prevalent narrative that's out there. On page 51, I'm gonna get moving here. It says the 1619 project is a targeted effort intended to show that the United States is to be hated because it is a racist and capitalistic nation whose roots must be destroyed and rebuilt upon a cultural Marxist foundation that will bring equality and justice to all. That is the goal of the 1619 project. Capitalism is viewed as a means of enforcing white supremacy, not as opposed to an economic political system that's designed to ensure freedom and anybody's ability to go into the marketplace and earn a living. Um, and so even capitalism is tinged with racism. I had a class 2 summers ago, and actually it was last summer. I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was last summer or 2 summers ago. I can't remember now. But anyway, I had a class, and in the class, this there were some black students that were in the class, and it was amazing. I mean, it's like, can we conduct a class without this stuff coming into play in the discussions? And sure enough, toward the end of the week, they said, well, we're going to set aside some time to talk about this at the end of the week. So let's kind of have those conversations at the end of the week. So I reached after that conversation that took place. I just listened basically because I'm not going to jump into this. I've already been through this enough times. So I just listened and to what they had to say, and then I reached out to the two guys that were black, and and I said, hey, would you guys mind? I said, I said, there's an alternate view of what you're presenting that I would love to discuss with you and get your feedback on. Would you guys mind if I reached out to you and we set up some time and had a conference call about that, just the three of us? And I said that in front of the whole class, and and they said, okay, sure. So I did, and I had a couple of conversations with them, and one of them dropped out of the conversations because he realized, okay, this is not this is he's you know he's not buying into what I'm saying. And the other guy, he continued the conversation, and he continued to put on a front of kind of being really nice and that sort of thing. until I just kept asking questions. And I wasn't being mean or anything like that. I was just asking questions. Well, how do you reconcile that with this? And okay, what do you mean by that? And as I continued to drill, eventually, I think he got to the point where he was like, he really kind of opened things up and revealed where he's coming from. Both of them, and the first one was based here in the Dallas area, and his church, and I know exactly the church, I know of it. I don't know it that well, but I know of it, and I know what they're doing. And it's a black church, and they're involving themselves, and they decidedly picked a particular church here in Dallas, and he even said this in the conversation. Well, there's around that church, and the people who attend that church, they live in multi-million-dollar homes. And the reason why they're partnering with that church was to switch pastors, occasionally. And he mentioned all the reasons why. I won't go into all that. And even the choir and the way that they did quote unquote worship, that people needed to be assimilated more, and and all this. And I didn't get a chance to ask him, but I was like, what? It's interesting that you picked one of the wealthiest churches in Dallas to do that partnering with, and you didn't pick, my church, for instance. You didn't pick, the church out in, I don't know, Winsboro or someplace outside of Dallas. You picked the richest church in Dallas. Why? Well, the whole reason is they're laden with white guilt, and it's easy to impose that white guilt stuff, and I wasn't going to fall for it. And so I won't go any further, but I think I saved the text thread that I had with the other individual just for legacy purposes. I think I saved it somewhere because it just revealed how this stuff that we're talking about right here, this whole United States is evil, has an evil history, has a racist history, blah, 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 has infiltrated the church, and the white church and the black church. It's everywhere. And it is, quite frankly, it is not biblical. It is not biblical. So anyway, we'll talk more about that as we kind of move forward, how it's not biblical, I think, as we get further into the book, and we'll find more illustrations of that. But I just wanted to call that out as I've seen this personally. So and you probably have your own stories as well. Well, let's move on. We've only got a little bit of time here. I want to kind of get through this. Under the section entitled Rewriting the Constitution on pages 55 and 56, Rewriting the Constitution, he says, do you see any parallels to what has occurred since January 20th of 2021? And under this section of Rewriting the Constitution, on page 55, he mentions a Harvard Law Review article, and he says in January of 2020, interesting, in January 2020, okay, that's a year before the inauguration of Joe Biden on January 20th to 2021. And what happened the day after he was inaugurated? He had a whole list of executive orders lined up, and I don't even know if he knew what he was signing. And then not only that, but now there's this whole effort to pack the Supreme Court. Notice what he says. In January 2020, the prestigious Harvard Law Review published the article, Pack the Union, a proposal to admit new states for the purpose of amending the Constitution to ensure equal representation. In addition to packing the Supreme Court, which was a subject of the debates back in the fall of last year, there was also making D.C. a state. But the way that's represented here is making it more than one state, basically making it essentially a district in which there's this huge number of representatives, effectively, where there's a number of states that's carved out of this small little federal city, a city that's actually the only city created by the Constitution, and also making it a state or states, as well as Puerto Rico. So, it says 127 new states would be created within the District of Columbia. Well, I mean, my goodness, if you do away with this, the Supreme Court, if you pack the court to the point where it becomes essentially an extension of the legislature, and then you control the legislature like this, what have you done? You've completely destroyed the whole checks and balances of our federal government. And it goes on and says, rewriting the Constitution. Well, the parallels are the executive orders of the Biden oligarchy, uh, and the subsequent actions to try to pack the Supreme Court, and the arguments that you hear put forth that are really nothing but lies, um, to try to support that effort. So anybody else see anything else that came off of these pages regarding that question of rewriting the Constitution? Do you see any parallels between what he describes in those pages and what's occurred since January 20th? Okay, well, let's move to the next question. Same question, but for the section entitled The Secularist Foundation. Do you see any parallels in that section, pages 57 through 59, entitled Secularist Foundation, and what's happened since January 20th of 2021? Anybody see any parallels there? Well, here's just a couple. On page 57, he says the Humanist Manifesto strongly advocates globalism, no nationalism. And if you flip over to page 58, what do you have? If you go down to about 3/4 of the way down on page 58, he says, to overcome these obstacles to globalism, the humanists push for what amounts to open borders. Heard anything about maybe what's going on down at the border? I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with that, but it's pretty amazing, quite frankly. Let's see. And then, have you heard anything about social justice? He mentions how all of this stuff must be sold under the banners of compassion and justice, and he's specifically referring to social justice on page 59. So, in response to the question under the section entitled The Secularist Foundation, do you see any parallels to what has occurred since January 20th of 2021? I would submit to you that, yeah, there's been a huge move toward no borders, open borders, globalism by virtue of eliminating the nation effectively. If you have no borders, you don't have a nation. And this whole move towards social justice. I mean, everything in terms of race trumps everything else in the agenda that's being pursued. Okay, in the section entitled Learning from History, beginning on page 60, we have this section that's entitled Learning from History. Lutzer asks several key questions, and how would you evaluate his response? I don't know if we have time to go through all of this, but let me just run through them. If you do have a response, throw it out there. We'll deal with it, and then we'll just kind of move on. When we say, he says on page 62, he says, when we say goodbye to freedom, we welcome tyranny. But what about the church? Do we run and hide? What about the church? I think that's a pretty key question, don't you? Do we run and hide? Should the church never say anything about any of these controversial issues like social justice, critical race theory, the move toward open borders, and the destruction of nationalism? Is nationalism a biblically supported, principled concept? If it is, then what does that say about open borders? What does it say about immigration and non-immigration policies? So yeah, should the church just remain silent on all this stuff? Should the church remain silent while they hear things promoted that are totally like the Equality Act, that's going to basically say if you're a religious institution or your religious organization, you would have to hire a transsexual, a transgender person. You would have to hire them, or you might have to, if you're a doctor practicing in a Christian type clinic or a Christian-based hospital, that's supported it's a nonprofit and it's a Christian-based hospital. You have to violate your conscience formed by your religious principles, and perform an abortion. That's what the Equality Act would do. That's the kinds of things that are being promoted. Now, Should pastors say anything about any of that? What do you think? Should pastors say anything about that kind of stuff? Or should they just say, "Oh no, that's controversial. Um, I got a big donor base, and some of them are Democrats. Some of them are Republicans, and if I say something that goes against one side or the other, they may not like it." What do you think?
Steve, I'm not sure if that was a rhetorical question or not,
No, it's
but
open.
but I think the answer is obvious that hey, you have to say it.
Yeah,
I
it's
think
pretty
you're
obvious.
saying something.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks, Caleb. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, but I honestly, I hear pastors saying this kind of stuff, or I see them taking these stances where they just don't touch these topics. They don't touch them, and I'm like, man, if the Christians aren't getting educated in the church, now I'm not saying you have to do it on Sunday morning, but I'm thinking somewhere in the offering of the church, the educational offerings of the church, the teaching offerings of the church, there should be some kind of communication or some kind of venue where this stuff occasionally gets addressed, right? I mean, I think about the distinction between what Bonhoeffer did. You know, do you know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Does everybody know who? Well, if you don't know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer is, you might want to look him up. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor in Germany, and he stood up against the Nazis. And guess what? He ended up getting hung, and he stood up to evil. Well, now, okay, maybe he was wrong, maybe he was right, but he stood up to evil. So the question is, do pastors have a responsibility to stand up to evil? And back in the foundation of our country, you know what the catchphrase was, or the I guess the phrase was that pastors that were liberty pastors were promoting? Um, Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Now, I would I would I'm going to look around really hard to try to find a pastor that said something like that from the pulpit recently and taught his congregation, resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. You won't find it. You will find it, but it's going to be pretty rare. I know of one church at least where it's done, and there may be others. Okay, moving on. How should we as Christians respond to these issues? Those mentioned in the section entitled "America, the Church, and Our Future," page 63. Like on page 63, he has this section called "America, the Church, and Our Future." How should we respond? And he even says, let me just give you a few quotes here. He says, uh, the Bible teaches us as Christians to love our enemies, and as someone has pointed out, that means we must love our ideological enemies too. Okay, fine. I mean, I can speak in love to those of different ideological persuasion, but I'm not going to back away from speaking the truth. We must remember that for some people, emotions trump reason and civility. You ever seen that happen? Yeah. So it might be difficult to have a rational discussion of these issues. I'm like, that may be the understatement in the whole book right there. And he says down at the bottom of page 62, he says, we must stand for truth, but not succumb to the name calling we can expect to receive. That is very true. We don't need to take ourselves down to that level. We must fight for freedom, yet remember that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And to that point, what I've started doing whenever I post something or whenever I say something, and I know that I'm in a den of wolves, whether it be online or whether it be in person. I say respectfully, I have a different opinion. Respectfully, I'll throw the word respectfully in there. And I've even told somebody with whom I've disagreed. I've said, look, I love you, but I respectfully disagree. If you do that, if you approach it that way, you kind of diffuse the emotions a bit. You may not eliminate them entirely, but at least you diffuse the emotions. So, and quite frankly, that's the way we should do it as Christians. But it doesn't mean we have to back away from the truth. He says, that said, we cannot stand by and surrender to the radicals out of fear of being called racist. And that's the worst thing that could happen. If you're called a racist, guess what? People are going to run from you like the plague. Let's see. Down on page, he says, and on page 63, he says, how should we as Christians respond to these issues if they divide us? Well, The truth is divisive. It's going to divide, you know, and give up your mega church. If it means preaching the truth, if it means teaching the truth, pastor, and it's going to result in a division of the church, God's okay with that. What he's not okay with is with the lukewarm church that's compromising the truth so that you can hold together your mega church and pay for all of your campus. I mean, so anyway, moving on, he says on page 64, he says, but the church must lead the way toward reconciliation and not away from it. He says, and then he goes on and quotes someone. He says, another key question down here at page 64, he says, but how should we answer the larger questions about the trajectory of our nation and the destruction of our history? In Psalm 11:3, he quotes, he says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? He correctly says down at the bottom of page 64, the Church of Jesus Christ was not built on the U.S. Constitution. The church was launched 18 centuries before the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The church is not Americanism, is not built upon the foundation of our founding fathers, however important their contributions are. There is no doubt that Christianity in America has benefited from the nation's Judeo-Christian roots, but we must learn to survive without this support. Well, all that's true, but and while we need to have that attitude and while we need to have that perspective, it should not keep us from teaching the biblical principles that are applicable to these particular issues. And then I'll leave it at that for now. Okay, next question here. I just mentioned two quotes, and I asked questions about those quotes. And let me pause, and before I make this final point, finally, what did you think about Lutzer's prayer? Let me just go back to those last couple of quotes there. But how should we answer the larger questions about the trajectory of our nation and destruction of our history? Page 64. And does the future of the church rest solely with Jesus, with us, or with both? Page 65. Does anybody have anything to say about those two quotes, or anything within that section, America, the church, and our future? If they divide us, how should we respond? Anybody have any other thoughts there?
Hey, Steve, this is kind of related to this, but and I hesitate to ask this question because I'm afraid you may give me another assignment. But,
Okay.
but one thing that I thought about for a while is you talk about nationalism, and I'm trying to relate that to biblical principles, and I get the Tower of Babel and how all that happened,
Mm-hmm.
and but I'm just trying to come from it from a biblical point of view. I mean, I can obviously understand from a secular point of view the advantages of nationalism. I'm just looking
Mm-hmm.
at from a biblical point of view,
Mm-hmm.
how that is supported, and you don't have the answer right now because it's probably a longer question than we have tonight. But
Mm.
at some point, I would just be curious on your thoughts on how that's biblically supported.
Yeah, sure. Well, real quickly, and I'll do this in like 30 seconds or less to address the question succinctly now, and then maybe we'll spend more time on it later because it is a great question. What is the biblical support for nationalism, and should we be nationalist? And what do we do with the charges of Christian nationalism and the evils of Christian nationalism? They're all Christian nationalists. The Trump supporters that marched in Washington and showed up in Washington to voice support for Trump. Back on January the 6th. A fraction of whom were nuts and went and um, invaded the Capitol. And just a very small fraction, by the way, they were all Christian nationalists. So Christian nationalism is on the rise, and that's very evil. Okay, first of all, I'm a Christian, and I believe in nationalism. And nationalism now, it can be defined different ways, and you'll find different articles, and depending on the way it's defined, it makes a difference, right? So the biblical support for nationalism roughly falls into this line of support, I guess I should say. First of all, if you go back, like you said, you mentioned the Tower of Babel. And there was a specific command there to go and spread across the earth that they violated, and populate the earth. And then God, as a result of their disobedience to that command, under the leadership of under the leadership of certain individuals that are specified in Genesis, they disobeyed and revolted against that command and tried to stay together, and they tried to basically exalt themselves to heaven through the creation of the tower. Then what did God do? He came down. He gave them different languages and spread them throughout the earth. The whole reason for the creation of nations, and by the way, there's going to be nations in the perfect Jesus ruled kingdom. There will be nations. So it tells you something right there. Well, if you kind of look at the whole span of the Bible and what it has to say about nationalism, there's no specific statement in there that says nationalism is a God-ordained system. You're not going to find it that clearly stated. But when you look at what's implied and what's there that we can deduce or induce, I guess, from Scripture, what we can induce from Scripture is this: that nations and the concept of nationalism is a biblical concept to ensure the perpetuation of the human race until God's ordained purposes for the human race can be accomplished. That's about as succinct of a definition as in our support for the biblical concept of nationalism as you can find. Because God has purposes, and why? Man is fallen, and man in a fallen state, apart from nationalism, what would happen? We would have some of the same things that happened before the Tower of Babel and before the flood, actually happen and continue. And where there is no nationalism and you have a concentration of centralized power at the top, which is what Satan's going to try to accomplish in the days before Jesus comes again to establish his kingdom, he's going to try to emulate what Jesus is going to eventually do, which is have essentially a theocratic oversight of all the nations of the world. And Satan will try to emulate that, and he will try to make himself be the point of centralized oversight of all the nations and peoples of the world. So he's a counterfeiter. And what God did by instituting nationalism was a means of checking the sinful nature of man under the influence of evil ideologies injected originally into the human race before the canon of Scripture was ever begun to be recorded in writing. And nationalism is a way that God perpetuates the human race, or ensures the perpetuation of the human race, until its God intended purposes can be accomplished. So I don't know. That's a really succinct, quick answer, Caleb, and hopefully it suffices for now, but it's something we maybe need to delve into later in more detail. Thanks for asking that, though. It kind of reminds me of that we need to address that at some point. Finally, what did you think of Lutzer's prayer offered on page 69 at the end of the chapter? And since we're really at the end of time, I'll just open it up for that and just close with that question. Anybody have any responses to that prayer? Well, I thought it was a really well written prayer. I thought he did a great job with it. I thought it expressed the concepts that were sort of highlighted in chapter 2, and really it's a prayer that we all need to be praying, and churches need to be praying too. Well, listen, thank you guys. Thank you for the participation tonight. I didn't even think this would last an hour, but it did, which is it surprised me. But I really appreciate it. Let me just close out in prayer. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys joining in the middle of the week like this and being so actively involved in this review of this book. Hopefully you're benefiting from it, and you will continue to benefit from it. Next week we'll be looking at the chapter 3, which is use diversity to divide and destroy. We'll begin to see more and more information surfacing in the chapters ahead that is very, very much in the news and in our front page in the newspapers today. So just hang in there. This is good stuff. This is really getting us educated in terms of what's at play in the marketplace of ideas that we're confronting every day, so that we can actually be good witnesses of Jesus in the marketplace. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for everybody that took the time to join like this and discuss. Thank you for the contributions that people have made, the statements that Fran made, the statements from Caleb and others. Thank you for that. Thank you for Lutzer and what he did and what he wrote in this book. It's a valuable book for us. We pray, Heavenly Father, that you give us the wisdom to properly speak the truth, but do so in a very winsome way as we engage in conversations with people. And we lift all of this up to you in the name of our wonderful Lord and Savior Jesus. Amen. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you Sunday, hopefully. Y'all have a great rest of your week, okay? Bye-bye.